Over 3,000 years ago, a pharaoh made a decision so radical it would shake the foundations of an empire that had stood for millennia. He didn't just change a law or build a monument. He tried to erase the gods themselves, and when he died, Egypt's rulers made sure his name would vanish from history forever. They chiseled his face from statues, buried his city beneath the sand, and struck his reign from every official record. For over 3,000 years, it worked. But today, archaeologists are uncovering the truth about the most dangerous pharaoh Egypt ever tried to forget. This is the story of Akhenaten, the hidden pharaoh whose 17-year reign nearly destroyed everything the ancient world believed about power, faith, and the divine right of kings. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt, because this wasn't just a religious revolution. It was the world's first recorded attempt at erasing an entire civilization's identity and replacing it with something completely new. Tonight, we're going to uncover why Akhenaten's own people tried to erase him from existence, what archaeological discoveries are revealing about his lost capital city, and how his radical experiment in monotheism might have changed the course of human history forever. But first, let me show Egypt you just how successfully did this story bury. When archaeologists first discovered the ruins of el-amarna in the late 19th century, they found something that shouldn't have existed. Carved into limestone uncovered the remains of a massive cliffs along the Nile, a city that appeared nowhere in any historical record. No ancient Greek or Roman historian had mentioned it. No medieval Arab chronicler had written about it. It was as if an entire capital city had been deliberately erased from human memory. But the most chilling discovery wasn't the empty buildings or the shattered statues. It was how methodically the erasure had been carried out. Every inscription bearing the pharaoh's name had been chiseled away with surgical precision. Every image of his face had been deliberately defaced. Even the mud bricks used to build ordinary houses had been stamped with his name, and these too had been systematically destroyed. Someone had spent enormous resources and decades of work to ensure that not even a trace of this pharaoh would survive. This level of erasure was unprecedented in Egyptian history. When pharaohs fell from favor, their successors might ignore them or diminish their achievements. But complete erasure? That was reserved for enemies of the state, traitors who threatened the very soul of Egypt itself. What had this forgotten pharaoh done to deserve such treatment? The answer begins with a name change that would terrify the ancient world. Around 1353 BCE, a young pharaoh ascended to Egypt's throne under the traditional name Amenhotep IV. For 5 years, he ruled conventionally, honoring the ancient gods, maintaining the temples, and following the religious customs that had sustained Egypt for over 2,000 years. Then, in his 5th year of rule, something changed. He announced that he was abandoning his birth name and would henceforth be called Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten. To understand why this single name change sent shockwaves through Egyptian society, you have to grasp what it really meant. Egypt wasn't just a kingdom ruled by pharaohs. It was a theological state where the pharaoh served as the living embodiment of divine order, maintaining cosmic balance between the gods and mortals. The entire Egyptian economy depended on temples dedicated to hundreds of deities. Thousands of priests controlled vast estates, managed trade networks, and wielded political influence that rivaled the pharaoh himself. When Akhenaten declared himself effective for Aten, he wasn't just changing his name, he was declaring war on this entire system. Aten wasn't one god among many. According to Akhenaten's revolutionary theology, Aten was the only god. Every other deity that Egyptians had worshipped for millennia was suddenly declared false. The powerful priesthood of Amun, Egypt's state deity, found themselves branded as servants of illusion. Temples that had stood for centuries were ordered closed. Sacred festivals that marked the rhythm of Egyptian life were banned. But Akhenaten didn't stop there. In a move that demonstrated the terrifying scope of his vision, he announced that Egypt's capital would be moved from Thebes, the ancient seat of pharaonic power, to a completely new city that would serve as the earthly home of Aten. He called this city Akhenaten, meaning the place where Aten becomes effective. Today, we know it as el-amarna. What happened next reveals the true extent of Akhenaten's revolutionary ambition. Rather than gradually transitioning to the new capital, Akhenaten ordered an immediate and total abandonment of the old religious centers. Imagine the chaos this created. Thousands of government officials, priests, artisans, and workers were forced to pack their belongings and march hundreds of miles north to a city that barely existed. Families who had lived in the same neighborhoods for generations suddenly found themselves refugees in their own country. Archaeological evidence from this period paints a vivid picture of the upheaval. In recently excavated homes at the abandoned settlement of Aten, archaeologists have discovered something haunting. Residents sealed their doors before leaving, carefully closing up their homes as if they expected to return. Inside these sealed houses, archaeologists have found everyday items still arranged, as if the owners had just stepped out for a moment. Cooking pots still contain traces of the last meals prepared. Personal belongings remain neatly organized in storage chests. These weren't the hastily abandoned homes of people flee. These were the carefully disaster-preserved homes of people who believed they would eventually come back. But they never did. Because Akhenaten's new city was being built at unprecedented speed using revolutionary construction techniques. Instead of the massive stone blocks traditionally used in Egyptian architecture, Akhenaten's builders employed smaller, standardized blocks called talatat that could be handled by unskilled laborers. This allowed the new capital to rise from the desert in just 3 years, but it also created a city unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. The layout of Akhenaten itself reflected Akhenaten's revolutionary ideology. Traditional Egyptian cities grew organically around temple complexes dedicated to various gods. But Akhenaten was designed from the ground up as a monument to monotheism. Every street, every building, every decorative element was oriented toward the worship of Aten. The city's most sacred spaces weren't enclosed temple complexes accessible only to priests. Instead, they were open-air courtyards where the pharaoh and his family could worship under the direct rays of the sun god. This architectural revolution paralleled an equally dramatic transformation in Egyptian art. For over 2,000 years, Egyptian artistic style had remained remarkably consistent. Pharaohs were depicted as idealized, godlike figures with perfect proportions and serene expressions. But under Akhenaten, this changed overnight. The new royal art showed elongated skulls, narrow shoulders, wide hips, and strangely androgynous features that sometimes made it difficult to distinguish between Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti. Modern scholars debate whether these unusual artistic conventions reflected Akhenaten's actual physical appearance or represented a deliberate symbolic language designed to express his revolutionary theology. Some suggest that the androgynous imagery was meant to show that Akhenaten, as the sole intermediary between Aten and humanity, embodied both masculine and feminine divine principles. Others point to possible genetic conditions that might have given the royal family their distinctive appearance. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Akhenaten's artistic revolution wasn't how the royal family was depicted, but how ordinary people appeared in royal art for the first time in Egyptian history. Traditional pharaonic art focused exclusively on the divine pharaoh and the gods. Ordinary subjects were barely human stick figures, if they appeared at all. But in Akhenaten's art, we see detailed depictions of royal family life. The pharaoh plays with his children. The queen tends to domestic matters. These intimate family scenes suggested that even the divine pharaoh was, in some sense, human. This humanization of divine authority was perhaps even more radical than the religious revolution itself. For the first time in recorded history, an absolute ruler was presenting himself not as a remote, godlike figure, but as a loving father and husband who happened to serve as humanity's connection to the divine. It was a complete inversion of traditional royal ideology, and it helps explain why Akhenaten's successors worked so hard to erase every trace of his reign. The scope of this cultural transformation becomes even more apparent when we examine the diplomatic correspondence discovered at el-amarna. These cuneiform tablets, known today as the Amarna Letters, reveal that even while implementing revolutionary domestic changes, Akhenaten maintained Egypt's position as a major international power. Letters from Babylonian kings, Hittite rulers, and Syrian vassals show a complex web of diplomatic marriages, military alliances, and trade negotiations that continued throughout Akhenaten's reign. One letter from the Babylonian king Kadashman-Enlil reveals the sophisticated nature of these international relationships. In it, the king requests proof that his sister, who had been married to a previous Egyptian pharaoh, was still alive before he would agree to send his own daughter as a new diplomatic bride. Another correspondence shows the Mitannian king Tushratta negotiating an enormous bride price in gold for a princess destined to join the Egyptian royal household. These weren't the desperate communications of an isolated regime. They were the routine diplomatic exchanges of a superpower managing complex international relationships. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these letters is what they don't say. Despite the revolutionary changes happening within Egypt, foreign rulers seem largely unaware of Akhenaten's religious transformation. Their correspondence focuses on traditional concerns, military support, trade agreements, and diplomatic marriages. This suggests that Akhenaten was careful to present a conventional face to the outside world while implementing radical changes at home. He understood that Egypt's international position depended on projecting stability and continuity, even as he was dismantling the foundations of Egyptian civilization. This delicate balancing act becomes even more remarkable when we consider the internal resistance Akhenaten must have faced. The archaeological evidence suggests that his religious revolution was never universally accepted, even within his own capital city. Excavations at Tel el-Amarna have uncovered small shrines dedicated to traditional Egyptian gods hidden within private homes. Workers continued to be buried with traditional funerary objects, designed to protect them in the afterlife according to the old beliefs. Even within the royal workshops, craftsmen sometimes incorporated subtle references to banned deities into their work. This underground resistance reveals the limits of even absolute royal power. Akhenaten could order temples closed and priests dismissed, but he couldn't change what people believed in their hearts. The religious revolution that looked so complete on the surface was actually a thin veneer covering deep wells of traditional faith that continued to flow in secret. The tension between public compliance and private resistance became even more pronounced as Akhenaten's reign progressed. Around year 12 of his rule, something dramatic happened that fundamentally altered the nature of his experiment. Queen Nefertiti, who had been prominently featured in royal art as Akhenaten's equal partner in the worship of Aten, suddenly disappeared from all official inscriptions and monuments. Her name vanished from new building projects. References to her in official correspondence ceased entirely. What happened to Nefertiti remains one of Egyptology's greatest mysteries, but the timing of her disappearance coincides with evidence of growing instability within Akhenaten's regime. Archaeological evidence suggests that Egypt faced a series of devastating plagues during this period. Diplomatic correspondence shows increasing pressure from Egypt's enemies, who may have interpreted the religious upheaval as a sign of weakness. The royal family itself seems to have suffered multiple deaths, with several of Akhenaten's daughters dying in rapid succession. Some scholars believe Nefertiti died during this period of crisis. Others suggest she was exiled or fell from favor as Akhenaten's policies became increasingly extreme. But the most intriguing theory proposes that she didn't disappear at all. Instead, according to this interpretation, she assumed a new identity and continued to rule Egypt after Akhenaten's death under the name Neferuaten. The evidence for this remarkable possibility comes from a series of inscriptions that refer to a female pharaoh who ruled during the chaotic transition period following Akhenaten's death. This mysterious ruler used titles that had previously been associated with Nefertiti, suggesting a direct connection. Even more intriguingly, diplomatic correspondence from this period includes a letter from an unnamed Egyptian queen to the Hittite king, requesting that he send a prince to marry her and help stabilize Egypt because she had no son to inherit the throne. If this queen was indeed Nefertiti ruling as Nefertiti, it would mean that Akhenaten's revolution briefly survived his death under female leadership. The letter to the Hittite king suggests desperate attempts to maintain the new religious order through international alliance. But the plan apparently failed when the Hittite prince was murdered at Egypt's border, probably by traditionalist forces determined to restore the old religious system. This political crisis may explain one of the most puzzling aspects of Akhenaten's legacy: the rapid and total abandonment of his capital city. Within a few years of the pharaoh's death, el-amarna was completely deserted. Unlike other ancient cities that declined gradually over centuries, Akhenaten was abandoned so quickly that archaeologists have found intact workshops with tools still laid out, as if workers had simply walked away mid-project. The speed of this abandonment suggests it wasn't voluntary. Someone with enormous authority ordered the immediate evacuation of an entire city. But who had that kind of power, and why did they act so quickly? The answer may lie in the discovery of a massive cache of royal mummies that were apparently moved from Tel el-Amarna to the Valley of the Kings under cover of darkness. Among these mummies is one that has sparked decades of scientific debate. Designated KV-55, this badly damaged burial was discovered in 1,907 inches, a small, hastily prepared tomb. The mummy had been partially destroyed, apparently by tomb robbers, but enough remained for modern genetic analysis. In 2010, DNA testing confirmed that this individual was both the son of Amenhotep III and the father of Tutankhamun, making him almost certainly Akhenaten himself. But the condition of the burial tells a disturbing story. Unlike other royal mummies, which were carefully preserved and buried with elaborate grave goods, KV-55 was found in what can only be described as a hasty, almost panicked interment. The mummy wrappings were of poor quality. The burial goods were minimal. Most tellingly, the face of the mummy had been torn away, apparently in antiquity, as if someone wanted to ensure that even in death, Akhenaten's identity would remain hidden. Recent forensic reconstruction of the skull has produced a face that matches the artistic depictions from Tel el-Amarna, confirming that this is likely Akhenaten's actual remains. But the reconstruction also reveals something unexpected. The pharaoh appears to have died young, possibly in his early 30s rather than the 40 years suggested by historical records. This raises troubling questions about whether his death was natural or whether Egypt's religious revolution ended in violence. The mystery deepens when we examine what happened to Akhenaten's immediate successors. The historical record becomes extremely murky in the years following his death, with multiple shadowy figures briefly occupying the throne, before the famous boy King Tutankhamun emerged as pharaoh. Originally named Tutankhaten in honor of Akhenaten's Gothed, young ruler quickly changed his name to Tutankhamun, signaling a return to traditional religious practices. But even this restoration wasn't straightforward. Recent analysis of Tutankhamun's tomb goods reveals a complex mixture of objects created during Akhenaten's reign, alongside traditional items honoring the old gods. Some scholars interpret this as evidence that the transition away from Akhenaten's revolution was gradual rather than sudden. Others see it as proof that powerful factions within the royal court were fighting over Egypt's religious future even after Akhenaten's death. The ultimate victory of the traditionalist forces is evident in the systematic campaign of erasure that followed. Teams of workers were dispatched across Egypt to remove every trace of Akhenaten's name from monuments and inscriptions. His revolutionary city was abandoned and left to be buried by desert sand. Official king lists simply skipped from Amenhotep III to Tutankhamun, as if the 17 years of Akhenaten's reign had never existed. This wasn't mere political revenge. It was an attempt to heal what many Egyptians saw as a cosmic wound in the fabric of reality itself. By erasing Akhenaten from history, his successors believed they could restore the divine order he had shattered and ensure that such a dangerous experiment in monotheism could never happen again. For over 3,000 years their plan worked, but they couldn't account for the persistence of archaeology and the refusal of buried cities to stay hidden forever. The rediscovery of Akhenaten's lost world began with a single limestone relief that shouldn't have existed. In 1887, a local Egyptian woman was digging for fertilizer in the ruins near el-amarna when her shovel struck something hard. What she unearthed was a cache of clay tablets covered in strange wedge-shaped writing that no one in the village could read. These tablets would eventually be identified as the Amarna Letters, diplomatic correspondence that revealed the forgotten pharaoh's international connections. But at the time, they were just mysterious artifacts that local dealers sold to European collectors for few coins a. What makes this discovery so extraordinary isn't just what the tablets contained, but what they represented. Here was physical proof of a pharaoh whose name had been so thoroughly erased that even the ancient historians had forgotten he existed. The tablets were written in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East, and they painted a picture of Egypt as a major power in a complex web of international relationships. Kings from Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire addressed their letters to a pharaoh whose name appeared nowhere in any known historical record. As archaeologists began systematic excavations at Tel el-Amarna, they uncovered evidence of a civilization that challenged everything scholars thought they knew about ancient Egypt. The city's layout defied every convention of Egyptian urban planning. Instead of the dense, organically grown neighborhoods typical of ancient cities, Akhenaten was laid out on a rigid grid system that prioritized access to sunlight and open spaces. Every building was designed to capture the rays of the morning sun, reflecting Akhenaten's obsession with solar worship. But the most shocking discoveries came from the residential areas where ordinary people had lived. Unlike other Egyptian cities where clear social hierarchies were reflected in housing quality, Akhenaten showed evidence of remarkable social equality. Workers' homes contained luxury items typically reserved for the elite. Craftsmen lived in houses with private gardens and sophisticated plumbing systems. Even more surprising, many homes contained workshops where residents produced art and crafts using techniques that had previously been monopolized by royal artisans. This archaeological evidence suggests that Akhenaten's revolution extended far beyond religion into social and economic reforms that would have seemed impossible in the rigid hierarchy of traditional Egypt. The pharaoh appears to have deliberately dismantled the class system that had defined Egyptian society for millennia, creating instead a community where status was determined by devotion to Aten rather than birth or inherited wealth. The implications of this social experiment become even more staggering when we examine the city's industrial areas. Recent excavations have uncovered massive to-glass workshops, dedicate production, metalworking, and textile manufacturing on a scale that rivals modern industrial operations. These weren't craft shops producing goods for local consumption. They were manufacturing centers producing luxury items for export across the ancient world. Chemical analysis of glass fragments found at sites from Greece to Mesopotamia shows that much of the colored glass used in ancient jewelry and decorative objects was actually produced in Akhenaten's capital city. This reveals something extraordinary about the scope of Akhenaten's vision. He wasn't just trying to change Egypt's religion. He was attempting to transform the kingdom into a different kind of civilization entirely, one based on technological innovation and international commerce rather than agricultural tribute and military conquest. The abandoned workshops at Tel el-Amarna contain evidence of techniques for creating artificial gems, producing steel-like metal alloys, and manufacturing glass in colors that wouldn't be seen again until the Renaissance. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Akhenaten's experiment was discovered in the city's educational facilities. Archaeologists have found evidence of schools where children from all social backgrounds learned to read and write, not just in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but in multiple languages including Akkadian, the international diplomatic language. This was unprecedented in the ancient world, where literacy was typically restricted to a small priestly and scribal elite. Akhenaten appears to have been attempting to create Egypt's first literate society. The curriculum in these schools reveals the true scope of the pharaoh's intellectual ambitions. Students learned mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering, alongside religious instruction about Aten. They studied maps of the known world and practiced diplomatic correspondence with foreign kingdoms. Most remarkably, they were taught to question traditional beliefs and think critically about religious and political authority. This educational revolution may explain why Akhenaten's successors were so desperate to erase his legacy. A population trained to think independently posed an existential threat to any system based on unquestioning obedience to divine authority. The scale of this educational experiment becomes clear when we examine the archives found in private homes throughout the city. Unlike other ancient Egyptian sites where written materials are found almost exclusively in official buildings, el-amarna has yielded thousands of personal letters, business records, and literary texts from ordinary residences. These documents reveal a society where literacy wasn't just widespread, but was actively used by common people to conduct business, maintain relationships, and express personal thoughts and feelings. One particularly striking example is a series of love letters between a young craftsman and his wife that were found in a modest home near the city's edge. Written in hieratic script with remarkable literary sophistication, these letters discuss everything from daily domestic concerns to philosophical questions about the nature of divine love and human mortality. The fact that ordinary working people were not only literate, but were using their literacy to explore complex emotional and intellectual themes, suggests a level of social development that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. This evidence of widespread literacy helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of Akhenaten's reign: how he managed to implement such radical changes without provoking widespread rebellion. Traditional Egyptian society depended on keeping the population ignorant of alternatives to the existing order. But Akhenaten deliberately educated his people, giving them the intellectual tools to understand and participate in his revolutionary vision. The result was apparently a society where citizens supported radical change, not because they were coerced, but because they were convinced. The religious texts found in these private archives provide unprecedented insight into how ordinary Egyptians experienced Akhenaten's theological revolution. Rather than the abstract, priestly hymns typical of traditional Egyptian religious literature, these documents contain personal prayers and meditations that reveal a deeply intimate relationship between individual believers and their God. People wrote about experiencing Aten's presence in daily life, about finding divine guidance in personal decisions, and about understanding themselves as direct participants in cosmic creation rather than passive subjects of distant deities. This personal, emotional approach to religion represents a fundamental shift in human spiritual consciousness. Traditional Egyptian religion was mediated through complex priestly hierarchies that controlled access to divine knowledge. But Akhenaten's reforms created what may have been history's first truly democratic religious system, where every individual could establish a direct relationship with the divine without priestly intermediation. The psychological and social implications of this change were revolutionary. The archaeological evidence suggests that this religious democracy extended into political participation as well. Administrative documents from Tel el-Amarna show evidence of local assemblies where residents debated community issues and made collective decisions about resource allocation and social policies. This wasn't the absolute monarchy typical of ancient kingdoms, but something approaching what we might recognize as participatory government. The sophistication of this political system becomes apparent when we examine the city's conflict resolution mechanisms. Rather than relying on royal decree or priestly judgment, Akhenaten appears to have developed formal procedures for mediating disputes through community dialogue and consensus building. Legal documents describe elaborate hearings where multiple perspectives were presented and decisions were reached through collective deliberation rather than authoritarian pronouncement. But this remarkable experiment in ancient democracy contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very freedoms that made Akhenaten's society so innovative also made it vulnerable to external pressure and internal division. As Egypt faced increasing military threats from expanding empires to the north and east, the decentralized decision that worked well for domestic governance proved inadequate for rapid military response. The final years of Akhenaten's reign show clear evidence of this systemic breakdown. Diplomatic correspondence becomes increasingly desperate as Egyptian vassal states in Syria and Palestine plead for military support against Hittite invasions. But the pharaoh's revolutionary government, designed for consensus and deliberation, couldn't mobilize resources quickly enough to respond to rapidly changing military situations. The very democratic ideals that had made Akhenaten a beacon of human possibility became a fatal weakness when confronted with the brutal realities of ancient warfare. The end came swiftly and violently. Archaeological evidence from the final occupation layers at el-amarna shows signs of hasty evacuation and deliberate destruction. Buildings were systematically stripped of valuable materials. Archives were burned. Even personal belongings were destroyed rather than abandoned, suggesting that residents had time to eliminate evidence of their participation in Akhenaten's experiment, but not enough time to save their possessions. The most chilling discovery came from the city's eastern cemetery, where archaeologists found evidence of mass burials from the final period of occupation. These weren't the careful, ritualized interments typical of Egyptian funeral practice, but hasty group burials that suggest either epidemic disease or violent conflict. Chemical analysis of the remains reveals high levels of copper and lead contamination, possibly indicating poisoning, though whether intentional or accidental remains unclear. This evidence points to a catastrophic end to what may have been humanity's first experiment in enlightened government. The dream of a society based on education, equality, and spiritual democracy died in the desert sand of el-amarna, leaving behind only fragments for archaeologists to puzzle over millennia later. But even in death, Akhenaten's revolution continued to haunt his successors. The very completeness of their attempt to erase him from history reveals how deeply his ideas had penetrated Egyptian consciousness. You don't spend decades systematically destroying every trace of someone unless their influence poses an ongoing threat. The massive resources devoted to erasing Akhenaten suggest that his revolutionary ideals continued to inspire resistance long after his death. Recent discoveries have begun to reveal the extent of this underground legacy. Hidden caches of texts have been found at sites across Egypt, containing copies of Akhenaten's hymns and philosophical writings that were secretly preserved by sympathizers. These documents show that the pharaoh's ideas about monotheism, social equality, and individual spiritual freedom continued to circulate in secret for generations after his death. Some scholars now believe that these hidden traditions may have influenced the development of other revolutionary movements in the ancient Near East, including the emergence of Hebrew monotheism and early Christian communities. The parallels between Akhenaten's theological innovations and later religious developments are too striking to dismiss as coincidence. The hidden pharaoh's fingerprints may be found throughout the spiritual evolution of human civilization. Modern forensic analysis of Akhenaten's mummy has revealed disturbing details about his final moments that official Egyptian records never recorded. When scientists examined the badly damaged remains found in Tomb KV55, they discovered evidence of trauma that suggests the pharaoh's death may not have been natural. Microscopic analysis of bone fragments shows signs of blunt force injury to the skull, while chemical residue in the mummy's tissues indicates possible poisoning with heavy metals commonly used in ancient assassination attempts. But the most telling evidence comes from the hasty, almost panicked nature of his burial. Unlike other pharaohs who were mummified with elaborate care over 70 days, Akhenaten's body shows signs of rapid, crude preservation techniques. The brain wasn't properly removed. Essential organs were left in place. The wrapping materials were of poor quality, suggesting whoever prepared his body was either incompetent or working under extreme time pressure. This wasn't the dignified interment of a pharaoh who died peacefully in his bed. It was the desperate concealment of evidence by people who needed to hide a body quickly. The location of his burial adds another layer to the mystery. Instead of being entombed in the elaborate sepulchre he had prepared for himself at el-amarna, Akhenaten's body was secretly moved to a small, unmarked grave in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb itself appears to have been originally intended for someone else entirely, hastily modified to accommodate an unexpected occupant. Whoever relocated the pharaoh's remains went to enormous trouble to ensure his final resting place would remain hidden even from future generations of their own royal family. This clandestine burial becomes even more suspicious when we examine what happened to the rest of Akhenaten's family. Queen Nefertiti's body has never been found, despite decades of searching in logical locations. Several of the royal daughters who died during the final years of Akhenaten's reign were also buried in secret locations that have eluded discovery. The systematic concealment of the entire royal family's remains suggests a coordinated cover-up involving multiple participants with access to royal burial resources. Today, as archaeologists continue to uncover fragments of Akhenaten's lost world, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The pharaoh who was erased from history may have been humanity's first glimpse of what civilization could become. His experiment in monotheism, social equality, and democratic participation failed not because it was wrong, but because the world wasn't ready for such radical change. 3 millennia later, we're still grappling with the same questions Akhenaten dared to answer. Can power serve justice? Can faith coexist with reason? Can humanity transcend the systems that divide us? The hidden pharaoh's revolution may have died in the desert sand, but his vision of a better world continues to whisper across the centuries, waiting for us to finally be brave enough to listen. And so we return to the question that began our journey into the lost world of el-amarna. What made Akhenaten so dangerous that his own people spent decades methodically erasing him from existence? The answer lies not in what he destroyed, but in what he dared to imagine. He envisioned a world where power served truth rather than tradition, where every human being could commune directly with the divine, where education replaced ignorance and equality challenged hierarchy. For 17 extraordinary years, that vision became reality in the desert of Egypt. A forgotten pharaoh built humanity's first experiment in enlightened government, created our earliest democratic society, and offered a glimpse of what civilization could become when guided by wisdom rather than force. His revolution failed not because it was flawed, but because it was 3,000 years ahead of its time. Today, as we piece together fragments of his shattered legacy, Akhenaten's questions echo with startling relevance. In a world still divided by ancient prejudices and governed by systems that serve power over people, the hidden pharaoh's vision feels less like ancient history and more like prophecy. His experiment in human possibility may have died in the sand, but his dream of a better world survived every attempt to bury it. Perhaps that's why his successors tried so desperately to erase him. They understood that some ideas are too powerful to kill, too necessary to forget. 3 millennia later, we're still trying to answer the challenge Akhenaten posed to human civilization. Are we brave enough to build the world he imagined? Or will we continue to bury our highest aspirations beneath the weight of what has always been? The hidden pharaoh is hidden no more. The question that remains is what we'll do with the revolutionary legacy he left buried in the sand, waiting for us to finally be ready to claim it.